So today we are talking about series and the basics for creating a novel. Let's just start with a quick who am I? For those of you who are new, I am best-selling co-author of Write the Novels That Sell series, and these are the books that we use for our courses in Fictionary Live. We've got more coming out than this, but these are the ones that are out right now. I'm an award-winning fiction author, and I'm the CEO and founder of Fictionary. So I created Fictionary from a breath of an idea, was nothing to what it is today. I have a background in I have a computer mathematics degree, which was my career before I started writing and realized what I really love to do is actually write. And then I realized what I really, really like to do is edit. And so Fictionary grew from there, and it started of just software to growing into our community and our courses. And part of that comes from everybody here who has been so lovely about giving us feedback and helping us grow, kind of together. Secrets to Writing a Fantasy is coming out this weekend-ish, so very soon. That's why it's got actually a book on it. Secrets to Writing a Romance and a Mystery are coming out later this year. I'm writing one with Linda O'Donnell and the other with Lisa Taylor. Many of you know both of them. The Secrets to Writing a Mystery will be turned into a Fictionary Live class. We don't have a mystery class yet, but it's coming. And for Secrets to Writing a Fantasy, anybody in Fictionary Live who's coming to the fantasy course is eligible for a ARC copy so that you have a chance to read it before the course starts early February. So let's get right into it. What is a series? This is a very important question since we're all here talking about what are our big decisions we need to make to create a series, what goes into a series, what types of series they are. And so what we're talking about is, first of all, what is a series and the things that are common to all genres. And then we can go from there. All right, so we'll start with a series is more than one novel. Seems obvious, but gotta state it anyway. It's just more than one novel. The novels are connected in some way. So either they're connected by a common plot or characters or settings. Those are the three ways to connect them. All right, so when you're writing a series, you have 10 artistic decisions to make, and I'm going to go through all of them. Anyone who's been through the series course is familiar with some of these. Anyone who's read Secrets to Writing a Series, all of the theory, they know this, all of the theories is in there in great depth of how to make these decisions and when to make them in your process. These are the things that you have to decide before you start writing a series. So what we're going to start with are the first decisions. So before you start writing, and the reason we say before is that it's difficult to change some of these decisions. An open series has an unlimited number of novels. And so if you're writing murder mysteries, for example, it could be following the same detective or sleuth. Each book is its own story. And so the detective tries to solve a crime in book 1, a different crime in book 2, a different time in book 3. A closed series is a fixed number of novels. And here we look at things like Hunger Games, Twilight, Fourth Wing, Game of Thrones, anything that has a fixed number of books. And there's one story told over all of the books. Also, one story told in each of the books. So you have a different responsibility as an author. In an open series, you are looking at one complete book in each novel, but they're connected by characters or setting. A closed series, you're looking at, if we look at the Hunger Games, for example, in book 1, Katniss has to survive the Hunger Games. That's the story goal. That's the whole story. Does she or doesn't she survive? In the series, it's about taking down the Capitol. And so by the end of the series, does she or doesn't she take down the Capitol? If you don't know which one of these you're doing yet, that's okay. We'll keep moving forward. And at some point, you're going to decide. You can also do spin-offs. So if you decide you're writing a 3-book closed series, quite often those, if it's popular, it turns into 4-book, 5-book, and you keep going. Or you do a prequel or a sequel or any of those things. So you're not boxed in. These are decisions that you hold loosely. And as we go forward, you're going to use them to help you make the rest of the decisions. And if you change them, then you come back here and you go down whichever side of the heart works for you. So the differences between an open series and a closed series. So the first thing is the number of novels. In a closed series, there's a fixed number of novels. The reader is expecting that they're going to get an answer to whatever the question is for the series of novels. In an open series, there's an unlimited number. You can keep going. There's lots of writers who do 20, 30 books of, cozy mysteries are very popular for this, detective mysteries, that sort of thing. In a closed series, there's one continuous story over multiple novels. And in an open series, there's multiple single stories with uniting factor. And this comes back to character or setting. In a closed series, there's a distinct story arc that spans the entire series. So for Hunger Games, for example, there is an inciting incident for the series, and there's also a climax for this series. And in between, there's a plot point 1, a middle plot point, and plot point 2 for the series. You're also going to have it for each book, but there's a high level overarching story arc. In an open, typically there's a generic story arc that can be applied to each novel, but there's not a story arc going across a group of novels. So if we look at a generic story arc, it could be something like the protagonist, who's a detective, must solve whatever crime, otherwise the murderer, the thief, etc., gets away. So very simple, so that every story, that's the story. In a closed series, there's a series goal, and that's addressed in the final novel. It cannot be addressed before, and it's the climax scene where does the protagonist achieve their series goal or not? So Hunger Games, does Katniss take down the Capitol or not? Last book at the end. In an open series, the story goal has to be addressed by the end of each novel, so that it doesn't linger from novel to novel to novel. There can be little subplots that go through, of course, but your main plot, it's closed off in every single book. In a closed series, it's typically a plot that unites it. So it's a story that goes from book 1 to the final book. And in an open series, there is something that unites those books, character or setting. In a closed series, they generally should be read in order. You don't always have to. And in an open series, you can read it in any order. It doesn't matter. You can pick up book 10, go back to book 1. It's all good. So we shall move on. Next decision, you have to decide the number of novels in your series. So when you're writing a closed, you want to have an idea. So this will give you a way of knowing how many scenes you're going to need to create your overall story across the series. And it will show you where in your story you need things like a middle plot point. So if you have 10 books, it's going to be somewhere in book 5-ish, right? On the open series, this big decision, because you're deciding on your uniting factor, and will it be characters or setting? And it's quite interesting because if we look at a series, the Roy Grace series by Peter James, for example, it's a character-based series because it's written about a detective, and each story is different, and he solves a crime in each story, but he's the uniting character that makes it an open series that he just keeps going. Jack Reacher, another one, he's an open character in a thriller-based series. The Bridgerton, very interesting. It's a setting-based series. And so there's 8 books. The protagonists are all Bridgertons, and each book is their romance. And so the uniting factor is setting, and that makes it a series. And I see Linda O'Donnell has just put up Stephanie Plum, also an open series. She's a bounty hunter. And so when you make this decision, you're making a promise to the reader. So in every Jack Reacher book, Jack's the guy. And if it was somebody else, it's not part of that series. You're really saying to the reader, it's this. In Bridgerton, we're making a promise that it's about a Bridgerton family member. So you can see by having the choosing if it's going to be character or setting based, it gives you some guidelines and it's going to help you stay consistent with your readers, and your readers are going to love it better. So the next thing we're going to do is look at a skeleton blurb. So anyone who hasn't been around, you might not know that skeleton blurbs are my favorite, I'll just say it again, favorite tool. And what is skeleton blurb? It's the shortest version of a series blurb that you can say who's the protagonist, what is their goal, and what's at stake. And a skeleton blurb is just for you. Nobody needs to see it. It's for you to stay focused and know what your story is about. And every scene you look at, you think of this skeleton blurb and is it contributing to this story? Even if it's a subplot, a romance subplot, a mystery subplot, it doesn't matter. It's all contributing to your story. So in a closed series, what we're looking for, so your homework, if you want it, is to write a skeleton blurb for your series. What's your series about? Who's the protagonist? What's their goal? What's at stake? And then for each book in your series, even if you have 12 books, you need to know what that book is. And then you have a visual of what your whole story is about. In an open series, because you don't know the number of books, write a specific skeleton blurb for the first 3 books in your series. And then from that, you can pull out a generic blurb that's going to work for the rest of the books in your series. And this again helps you keep your promise to your reader that when you deliver your book, it's going to be what they're expecting. They love, people love reading Stephanie Plum because she has a very specific way she writes, and it's the same story, but completely different in every book, and her readers keep coming back. So we do this because it helps you stay focused as you write, as you edit, as you outline, wherever you are in your story. And it also helps you know if every scene belongs in your novel. And we all know when you're writing, it's really fun to just write scenes, but sometimes they might not belong in the book you're writing. And the way to tell that is to look at your skeleton blurb and ask yourself, so the protagonist has a goal. So Katniss in the Hunger Games, her goal is to survive or she's dead. And if we look at every scene in that book, the scene either brings her closer to or farther away from her goal of staying alive. Every scene. If we're looking at a multiple point of view book where different characters tell different scenes, even if the protagonist is not in that scene, the other character is either making it easier or harder for the protagonist to achieve their story goal. That's it. And when you look at your scenes and ask yourself honestly, does this scene belong in this story? If you answer that question, you know it. And it's a very specific way to do it that's objective as opposed to subjective. So those are skeleton blurbs on both sides. We write skeleton blurbs, and we pick for the closed. You got to write one for every book in your series plus your series blurb. And then we look at the open and you write 3 and see if you can come up with a generic skeleton blurb from there. Now we get to outlining your series story arc or creating story arc patterns. What this means is we're looking at the story arcs for both your series, but also for each book in your series. And for the open series, we're looking at how do you create story arc patterns. And it's very interesting when you look at open series that in the inciting incident, for example, that's when the detective every time discovers the dead body. That's a pattern. And so it's going to be different crime, different place, different impact on the protagonist, whatever. But that's what happens. And we'll go through that in a little bit. Demi says, what kind of consideration should go into the number of novels wanted in a closed series? If you don't know at all and you really just don't know, start with 3. 3 is the most popular. It's what sells best, so why not pick it? And then when you do that and you go through this process, you'll see, oh, I actually need 6 books or 12 books. And people who come through and do the Fictionary Live Series Foundation course often change their mind on the number of books by the time they get through the series. So again, don't get too worried now. Pick 3, and then you can go from there. And what I mean by creating a series story arc, so if we look at plot point 1, this is the easiest place to start. So you have a skeleton blurb that says your protagonist must solve a crime, otherwise the criminal gets away. The main event of plot point 1 is the protagonist accepts the story goal of solving the crime. That's it for now. And we do this so that when you have your 5 story arc scenes, inciting incident, plot point 1, middle plot point 2, and climax, in one quick sentence, as a start, you can see your story. And then if you know more detail, add more detail. That's fine. If you don't, it's just the protagonist is accepting the story goal. And the story goal for book 1 in a closed series is going to be different from the story goal for the final book in the series. The story goal for the final book in the series is probably the same as the series story goal, because this is where we're going to find the answer in the climax scene. In the open series, we're looking for patterns. So you're looking for that main event. And if you put for your plot point 1s, just because the easy place to start for each of your books, then you start looking for, well, what's in common and what's going to help bring the series together in a unity. And you can always add to this. So again, if you're stuck, keep going. You know you're going to come back and do this later. Do what you can, keep moving. It will be more fun, first of all. It will spark your creativity. And when you get to the end, you might go, oh, I know what I need in my inciting incident now. And it will do that for you. So let's just talk a little bit about the story arc. So, okay, I should have said before I click the start, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you the ending of every book I ever talk about. So most of them are quite commercially successful already. So hopefully you know the ending. So here we are, the inciting incident. All this is in a story is something that shakes up the protagonist's world. So what's the big change? And they have to react to it in some way. Usually comes either before the story starts or anywhere up to 15%. If it doesn't come early enough, then the reader gets bored because nothing's happening and they're waiting for it to happen. All we're looking at is somebody's ordinary world. So for Katniss, we'd just be watching her going around hunting. That's it. She's shooting a rabbit for her family and feeding them dinner. Okay. But if she does that too long, you're thinking, that's really nice. Great, you're feeding your family, but you need to do something else. So along comes the inciting incident. If there is no inciting incident, there's no story yet. This is really important. If nothing changes the protagonist's world, there's just not a story. Something has to happen that drives the protagonist to do something, or the protagonist is doing nothing. And all of these plot point scenes have a reason for being in the story. In plot point 1, generally it comes between 20 and 30%. Now these are ranges that are flexible because they move around a little bit. When you start adding subplots, you have more flexibility than if you're just doing straight up one story. And in plot point 1, the protagonist accepts the story goal. So in Hunger Games, the inciting incident, Katniss has volunteered for the Hunger Games. And basically everybody who goes to the Hunger Games, one person survives. That's it. Everybody else dies. In plot point 1, as soon as she enters that arena, she's accepted the goal of fighting in the Hunger Games and surviving. Up to that point, she could have found ways to escape. She could have done, any multitude of things. Once she's in the arena, she can't get out. She's in, it's locked. That's it. She has to move forward. So this is her accepting the story goal. And again, if there's no plot point 1, the protagonist has not accepted the story goal, so they're not doing anything. And if too long goes between the inciting incident and plot point 1, the reader gets bored because they know. Then we get to the middle plot point. And the middle plot point across all genres is the protagonist changing from a reactive state to a proactive. So a couple of things here that are important. Just because they go from reactive to proactive doesn't mean they weren't active before. So up until the middle plot point, something's happening, they're reacting. Something's happening, they're reacting. But they're in action, in motion. After the middle plot point, they're driving the action. They make a decision. They're going to take control of this story, and they make a ton of mistakes to bring them to plot point 2. And here, Katniss allies with another character, Rue. And the two of them go after the food source of the other characters who are in the arena. And they proactively do things to try and survive. For up until that point, Katniss is hiding in a tree. She's doing all things to stay alive, but she's reacting. She's not driving. For the middle plot point, if there isn't one, the protagonist has no direction. So it's very unlikely they're going to get to the climax scene because they're not driving the story, which means, again, there is no story. So there needs to be a point where the protagonist takes control of the story. Then when we get to plot point 2, this does 2 things. Plot point 2 is an amazing thing. One, it brings the character to their lowest point in the story. And so something happens here. Now, Katniss has made friends with Rue. She basically loves this little girl, and Rue is murdered. So she's at her lowest point because of that. The other thing that happens in plot point 2 is the protagonist gets the final piece of information they need so they can succeed at the climax. And the reason it's the final piece of information is at some point they have to have all the data that they can either achieve or completely fail in the climax scene. And if this doesn't happen, if they don't get that final piece of information, they'll never get to the climax scene. So if we take that away, we don't have a story yet. And that's why this is important. And in the Hunger Games, the piece of information that Katniss gives, she kills another boy. And up and until this point, she has absolutely avoided killing everybody. She's trying to survive without doing that. Until she admits to herself she can actually do that, she cannot be the last person alive. She has to kill somebody. And so she gains the piece of information here that she's actually capable of doing that. And then we get to the climax scene where Katniss and Peter win the games. Then the story is over and we get to resolution. If there's no climax, so if we don't address the story goal, the story's not over. There is no story. And the climax scene, it can't just be an exciting big chase scene, explosion scene, whatever. It has to be a scene where that goal is answered. So that's a very short, this is what a story arc scene, the story arc scenes are for one book. And then if we go to a series story arc, this is just a very high level view of what you need for your overall series. And connecting these scenes together, this is how Hunger Games did it. But there's many different ways to do it. So don't try and force it in your own work. This is an artistic process. This is information to look at and then decide what works for your book. And so in book 1, the inciting incident is Katniss volunteers for the Hunger Games. That's also the inciting incident for the entire series. And so for book 1, it's just, her goal is just to survive. And for the series, her goal is to take down the Capitol. Otherwise, everyone she loves will either die or live a life of misery. And those are the stakes. So you can see the stakes for book 1 are smaller. It's only her life. Stakes for the whole series, bigger. It's everybody that she knows and loves. And as you go through your series, your stakes from book 1, book 2, book 3 in a closed series are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in book 2, the stakes are Peeta as well as her. So it was her and Peeta, everybody. Stakes going up. So then we look at plot point 1 of the series. And this is where, even though Katniss doesn't know it, this is where she accepts the series story goal of taking down the Capitol. The reason for this is she's on television, or whatever their televised thingy is, and she defies the Capitol, and people love her for it. And they start talking about her leading the revolution. And so this is her accepting the story goal. So the protagonist doesn't actually have to know they've accepted the story goal at this point in the series, but the author does. And so this is an author-controlled thing. In the middle of book 2, we have both a series middle plot point where she starts believing she can lead the rebellion. And we have book 2 middle plot point where the arena is structured like a clock and she's figured out how to survive in this arena, something bad happens at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, etc. And she's figured it out, so she can now get ahead of it or behind it and not be attacked by whatever it is that happens at that time. So these two things happen basically in the same scene. And then the series plot point 2 is where Pete is taken and District 12, which is her home, is destroyed. So that's her plot point 2 moment. And then when we get to plot points in book 3, this is where they start to converge. So we have plot point 2, Prim dies in book 3. That's her lowest point in the book. It's also her lowest point in the story. She volunteered for the Hunger Games to save Prim. Completely fails. This is her sister she loves. And then the climax is the same scene, and that's typically what happens in all series, but typically this is where you're going to see the final book climax and the series climax in the same thing. Okay, so now we'll do a quick look at the open series. Open series, this is the generic story arc. So if we look at the Bridgerton series, in every book in the inciting incident, and in a romance, this is where the love interests meet. That is the inciting incident in every romance. And in this particular romance, every love interest, they meet at a ball. So that's the thing that's in common in the story arc scenes. In plot point 1, they accept, there's a romantic trope accepted. So fake dating, for example. Two are going to pretend they're dating, even though they're not. That's how this author is making something in common with plot point 1. And in the middle plot point, whoever the protagonist is, the Bridgerton protagonist, they save their love interest. In some way, it's always different, but that's what they do. And then between 70 and 80%, there's some misunderstanding and the couple breaks up. And then 85 to 95%, they have their happily ever after moment. So each book in this series is doing this in a different way. So it's similar, but different. And it's what makes people come back, that people love this pattern and they want to go from book to book to book to book. And you know, on the Bridgerton series, they're going to end up together. Of course they are, but people read it anyway because they love it. It's a thing that people like to do. And that's what an open series is all about, is giving a reader familiarity. You've made a promise to them. These are the books you're writing, and they come back to read those books, which is really an amazing thing. So then we get to series structure test. So I'm just going to explain I'm going to go and just right into closed and to open. So the closed series, you want to ask yourself, after you've made these decisions, does the climax scene in the final novel address the series story goal? It must. So that's test 1. Are the stakes higher in each consecutive novel? And I can tell you, this is very difficult. It seems like an obvious thing when you see it in other books. But when we went through, we've gone through quite a few series courses, and this is often where people struggle. And when they write their skeleton blurbs for each book and they look at the stakes, quite often it's not going up higher and higher and higher. And this is a way, using the skeleton blurbs, to make sure that happens. Otherwise, the series isn't going to be satisfying. And then, does each scene have a different climax scene? So it can't be, Susan took an axe and killed somebody and that's the climax. And in the next book, well, she did the same thing. She has to do something to win in the climax. That's different from each book, or the reader's going to think it's predictive and they won't go to the third book in the series. So that's the series structure test for closed series. Open, is there a setting or a character that unites all novels? So depending on what you're doing, do you have that character like Jack Reacher that's all the way through it? Or do you have a setting like the Bridgerton novels? Is each novel a standalone story? And here in Fictionary Live, we get into the full detail of how to transition from a book 1 to a book 2 and leave enough hints that the reader wants to read the book, but not so much they don't feel satisfied. They need to be able to walk away from book 1 and feel like the story is done. And then, does each novel have different story arc scenes? If we look at Bridgerton and we look at they meet at a ball, great, that's the thing that's similar. But what's different is how they meet. There's a different scandal, some different drama happens. And so it's interesting to the reader because it's different every time. They know they're going to meet, but it's different. So then we get to the rest of the decisions. So you're going to look at how to do a setup in your story. So your opening image, what are you going to do in each book? And a resolution, how are you going to close each book? And in either type of series, there's an ordinary world, and no matter what, that ordinary world is a little bit different for the protagonist from book 1 to book 2, book 2 to book 3, etc. Katniss's case, she started her ordinary world, she's starving, and her ordinary world in book 2 is she's fully wealthy, she has a ton of food, it's a completely different world. She's still fully controlled by the capital, but her world is completely different. So ordinary worlds change, and the resolution has to lead to the ordinary world of the next story. By protagonist strategy, we're looking at, will you have a single protagonist like Katniss, who is one? Will you have a combined protagonist like love interests in The Wedding Date, where they share the same story goal and the same story stakes? Or will you have a group protagonist like a Game of Thrones, where it's the whole human race against the White Walkers, and they share their goal of eliminating the White Walkers? Point of view strategy just means who's telling the story in every scene. And if we look at Katniss, she is the point of view character for every scene. And if we look at Bridgerton, it switches between the love interest and some of the family members. So there's multiple points of view. And these are near the end because you kind of need to know where you're going with this, but not as important as the previous decisions. Narrative strategy is just, are you writing in first person, second person, which is not as common, but you do find it. Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, I think, is a second person story. Typically Twilight's first person, Bridgerton third person. So you need to decide how you're writing it, or are you doing a combination of these strategies? And then the final thing is, what tense? Are you writing in present tense, past tense, or combination of the two? And so these are things you need to be consistent with when you're writing your story. I'm going to go over to the app. So in the Fictionary app, normally when you come in, you end up on the journey. And to get to your bookshelf, you just click My Bookshelf. And here you can outline and write a novel. So you can apply all of this theory to editing your novel, or you can apply it to outlining your novel or writing it. Just depends where you are in the process. And I know we have people at all different stages of your writing journey with your books. So to outline a novel, you have some choices to make. And you can do a universal outline, which is the story arc that we talked about today, that all genres have these basic functions. You can do a fantasy outline, a romance outline, mystery is coming, open series, closed series, or no outline if you just want a free-for-all write, which is great too. When you come in here, if we start just with a closed series, and we'll just call this closed guest. So you name your project. And the goal behind this outline is, when it's not to write each book, it's to figure out what your overall story is for your closed series. And so in each of these scenes here, we have a book 1 opening image. There's notes that describe what that opening image should do to help you through that. And as we work through the series course, the outlining course, we type in main events. What's the main thing that happens in the opening image? And every book has an opening image because it's page 1. And so what we've put here is we've put up the key scenes that you need in a story. So you need an opening image. You need a lead up to the inciting incident. You need an inciting incident. All these two could happen before the story. Opening image is always on the page because it's page 1. But you could have a book like Fourth Wing, where the lead up and the inciting incident is before the book. So the order here, or if you write them as separate scenes or a single scene, that's up to you. This is just to show these are the functions that need to go in it. Then we have a reaction to the inciting incident. Typically there's a resistance to the story goal. The protagonist hasn't accepted it yet. And then sorry, resistance to story goal. Then we have the lead up to plot point one. So what happens right before they accept the story goal? What is it that is going to change once they accept the story goal? Then we have the accept the story goal and a reaction to it. And the key to these things that's really interesting is the lead up is usually the character motivation of what they're trying to do in this book, and the reaction is their character growth. And so something dramatic always happens in a story arc scene, and the character has to react to that. They can't not react. That Katniss, for example, she has just volunteered for the Hunger Games. Well, how does she feel about that? What does she do next? What happens? That's the reaction where she starts to grow as a person. Then there's typically 3 goal attempts. You could have more, you could have less. The key here is all of the goal attempts are different. Then we have the lead up to the middle, and then the middle and the reaction, same things as the others. And again, in the notes, it will describe what you need for each of these. Then after the middle plot point, there becomes external pressures. So things happen to make life much more difficult for the protagonist, and off they go, trying to get to, oh, that should actually say plot point 2 here. We're going to fix that. And then reaction to plot point 2. After plot point 2, typically the protagonist understands their story goal wasn't what they thought it was something different. And here's the interesting thing. As the author, you know what the story goal is, and that's what goes in your skeleton blurb, because it's for you to control your story. You wouldn't put it in the book description, that's different, but for your skeleton blurb, you want to control your story of where it's going. Then we have the lead up to the climax, reaction to the climax, resolution, and the closing image. And then we do it all over again for book 2. And then we do it all over again for book 3. However many books you have. The first thing is, if you can put a minimum of your 5 story arc scenes in and then build around it, you have a very good idea of what your story is about. So if we just go back to my bookshelf and we do a quick import here, we'll do an open series and I'll show you what that is. Oops. We'll do an open test. Okay, and so here we have book 1, we have book 2 and book 3. And all we're doing at this stage, the early stage, is we're looking at what are inciting incident, plot point 1, middle plot point 2, and the climax, to get you to a place where you have enough stories to know that you have a series and you can actually write a series. The other thing that will happen, if you go all the way to book 3, it's going to influence what you're going to put in book 1 and book 2 just by doing main events, very short descriptions of what happens in each of these scenes. So those are the 2 outlines there. I just wanted to cover a little bit for anyone interested in joining Fictionary Live, so you know what you're getting into. Fictionary Live is designed to start you with story foundations. So this is either you're outlining your novel or you're doing a after draft outline. So you're going back and making sure you have all the reader expected scenes in your story. Then you can move on to the genre expectations, so the fantasy course, the romance course. Once your novel is done, you identify and evaluate issues. That's editing part 1. Then you look at the scene level. So you start at structural level, then you go to scenes. And editing part 2 is based on doing your revisions after you've evaluated your entire story. Series can come in here. It can come here. So it depends on where you are in your series journey and where you're going to take the courses. But the thing to know about these courses, you can take them as many times as you want. So you can attend one, attend another, attend it again. And as you go and learn, you'll figure it out. So the next one coming up is 6 weeks to structure your entire series. So the first class in that series is laying the groundwork. So you're looking at open and closed. Then we're going to look at the skeleton blurbs. Then we do the structure of the series on the arc, and then we look at unity across the books, then we test it, and then we go into the final protagonist narrative tension strategy. So Lisa Taylor is your lovely instructor for that. Starts on the 14th at 10 a.m. And they go every week for 6 weeks with the goal that you're actually working on your story. So if you're thinking on this, start thinking about doing these things. The other thing I want to mention, for I know there's a lot of people here writing a fantasy. Clark is coming to do a free event in the community, and he wrote the book, The Magic System Blueprint, which is a fiction writer's guide to building a magic system. And anyone who likes fiction is going to love this book because it's all about structure of a magic system. And so if you take the structure of a story arc and the series story arc, and then on top of that, you build your magic system. And it's really, really a fascinating book because he has a process and he lays it out. So if you want to come to this event, please RSVP. Get Clark's book. I read it and just thought it's such a perfect book to collaborate and is complementary to everything that we do in Fictionary, that I reached out to him and asked him if he would come and talk to everybody about magic systems and what needs to be done there, because he's an expert on that. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a great day, and we'll see you around the community.